If you say the word digital ID, you end up talked about in a YouTube video.
Is the Privacy Act making privacy worse, not better?
It might be at the expense of outcomes for citizens.
How did we wind up with this kind of digital spaghetti bowl? Welcome to the Functional Government Podcast. Canada has over 270 different digital services. There's 60 different usernames and passwords, owned by 30 different departments, and none of them can tell each other anything about you, which means if your address is right in one place but wrong somewhere else, those two won't be corrected. Every single time you want to log into a new department, you have to get a username and password, figure out how to authenticate yourself, and then confirm you are who you are and provide it with all your data all over again. If that sounds insane, well, there's a bunch of reasons why we are that way. We have a Privacy Act that explicitly prohibits different departments from sharing information with one another. This is a long history of Canadian rule, complicated by the fact that we have federal and provincial jurisdictions that control different parts of our identity. I wanted to understand the complex nature of these issues, everything from authentication to sharing privacy information to the progress the government is making trying to tie these things together. We were lucky enough to be able to sit down with Tim Bouma. He's someone who's worked at the forefront of policy for the federal government for over 20 years, designing some of the original systems and speaking to people from countries around the world who've solved these problems. And Tim recently retired, so he was able to speak with us candidly about what he's worked on, what the problems are, why you have to type that information in over again, why you log in with your bank, and why it might get better. Hey, Tim, it's great to see you. Before we dive into this topic of single sign-on and login identity, tell us a bit about yourself, what you've worked on, and why we should listen to you when we talk about digital identity.
I literally just retired from the public service like 3 weeks ago. So just prior to this, I was on Interchange, which is basically being assigned outside of Government of Canada, and I was with the Digital Governance Council. And what I brought into that role was all the expertise that I had developed over the years when I was at Treasury Board Secretariat of the federal government, where I developed the Treasury Board policy around identity management, digital identity. And I was also involved with the major initiatives such as Sign in Canada, cyber authentication renewal. I've been working on digital identity for more than 20 years. I think I got into it around 2003, 2004, where I did work with the federal government, became federal public servant, and literally have seen the evolution from the early 2000s to today.
So I guess we got the right guy on the call.
25 years ago, there was a creation of what was called the longitudinal labor file, where someone said, hey, this is a great idea. We've got the social insurance number. Let's create a master file. And it was a good idea. But then at that same time, this is when privacy concerns really came to the fore. And there was a complaint to the Privacy Commissioner, and the Privacy Commissioner in turn did a complaint to the Government of Canada. And then Treasury Board responded by tightening up the controls around the social insurance numbers. What happened was that a lot of these departments are very sensitive to working within their authorities and working with their data banks, if you will, and making sure that they do what they're supposed to do according to their mandate and their authorities, and they don't look across what's happening in the other departments in relation to citizen. There's been lots of discussion about tell us once, citizen-centered service. Well, you have to realize that these services have evolved for years, if not decades, on a very specific mandate and authority. So it's very difficult to share information between departments and agencies.
So as I understand it, the Privacy Act says that a department can't share your data with another department. And that strict compartmentalization, which was created back in 1983, causes data sprawl, multiple copies of the same information stored in different systems with varying security standards, which creates more attack surfaces rather than fewer. So instead of one hardened vault, we have 30 filing cabinets of varying quality. What that means is that my personal address lives in 30 different government databases, each of which is a potential breach point. Is the Privacy Act making privacy worse, not better, by forcing every department to keep their own copy of my data?
Yeah, the outcomes are certainly worse. The Privacy Act, I think, when did it come into effect? About over 20 years ago?
Yeah.
1983, a very different world than it is now. and it was looking at it strictly from a data protection point of view. It wasn't looking at from a citizen service point of view. It was all about data protection. And if anything, we're almost our own worst enemies, demanding privacy and demanding that information not be shared. Well, I'm not criticizing, but the departments are falling back to what's actually on the books. The Federal Privacy Act is a law. The Personal Information Protection Electronic Documents Act is a law. And then backing that up further, you have the Treasury Board policy on privacy protection, and they follow that, and that's what they're evaluated. And I hate to say it, it might be at the expense of outcomes for citizens, but that's reality.
So for someone trying to file their taxes, apply for employment insurance, and renew their passport, that's 3 different logins, 3 different passwords, 3 different systems. Estonia managed to get 99% of their population using one digital ID for everything back in 2002. We're in 2025. Canada has 270 online services with over 60 different login systems. How did we wind up with this kind of digital spaghetti bowl?
Well, it's always a function of history, how things have evolved. Everyone holds Estonia as the exemplar case, and I totally respect what they've done. However, they came from a completely different context. The fall of the Soviet Union, when the Soviets pulled out in 1991, Estonia had the opportunity to build everything from scratch. And fortunately, they had some very visionary people that said, we need to institutionalize a new way of doing things. And that's where they came up with the idea of only one record for a citizen, tying it together with what evolved to the X-Road initiative. And you have to give them full credit for what they've done. Whereas in Canada, these programs have been around for decades, if not hundreds of years. I think the Social Insurance Register, it was created in 1964, built on mainframes, and then evolved. And then you had the taxation system. I don't know the details there, but it evolved.
And you never had the
separately.
expectation that a citizen would be using a device to access their data directly. They'd always be talking to somebody who had access to a mainframe, right? So these laws are like 70 years old, the structures at least, but we have this incredible misunderstanding of what's actually going on. I have a friend in Alberta, and when she logs into her CRA account using her Toronto Dominion Bank credentials, she thinks that the government can now see her banking information because she's used TD to log into the CRA. That's not really what's happening, right? So can you walk us through what actually happens when she clicks that sign in with your bank button?
Yeah, keep in mind when the strategy was developed for this back in 2007, really the only online behavior that had crystallized was online banking. This is before the time of Facebook and Google. Well, they were around. Well, Facebook really came to the public in 2007, and Google hadn't even opened up their Gmail or anything like that. So back then, the only real e-commerce and login systems that existed that were being used with reasonable confidence were the online banking systems. We were looking at that and saying, well, the government of Canada had developed a authentication system called ePass that was from Secure Channel. And no surprise, it went to major cost overruns, became very, very costly. It was originally like a $90 million project. It ended up being upwards of $500 million for setting up an authentication system. Oh yeah, this is all before the Sign in Canada stuff. There was a system called ePass, you know, the .com boom and government online. So there was a lot of energy on pushing everything to the web, creating an authentication service, creating a messaging bus service, timestamp, you name it.
Are those all the kinds of things that Estonia did? I mean, the XPass was a messaging bus. So we tried to do the thing Estonia had.
Yeah, like there was a secure channel, secure messaging bus that never really went anywhere.
Just for the muggles in the room, secure messaging bus is just a way for 2 different systems to talk to one another securely.
What's really interesting is that what Estonia had done was before the web really took off. So they used some different architecture and some different like messaging that we talked about before all the web-based stuff really took off in like 2000, 2003. To everyone's credit, Canada was a leader back in 2004. There was an initiative called the Government Online. That's where the CIO branch was created, and there was an incredible amount of positive energy. It was like the .com boom for the public service, and that was an exciting time. But the problem was you develop these systems, and It happens in the private sector too, where there's a lot of investments and then you realize that there isn't a return on investment, or you build something that's costly. So the same thing happened with the initial authentication system. It became very costly. So there was an initiative to say, hey, we have to transition off this proprietary system that we built in-house. We have to go standards-based. Let's take a look at what the industry is doing, and the industry would be better positioned to evolve with the cybersecurity threats around authentication. So we decided to develop an approach where we knew that the majority of Canadians were already doing online banking, maybe not the majority, but a large proportion. They were quite familiar with it. And so we developed a system where we could actually take the authentication when you sign in from Scotiabank or RBC or whatever. You could log in, you get like a session, and then it would go through what's called a broker. So by the time it hit the Government of Canada sites, we knew that we had a real person at the other end of the line. It was the same person as before. We knew that they were coming through an institution that had an interest in providing a real person.
So basically, you're trusting the bank, and the bank's trusting you. And then the government service goes, okay, broker, I believe you, you believe the bank believes the person, therefore it's the real person.
Yeah, but we didn't know who the person was, and we'd have to go through our own separate identity proofing process.
Oh, so you then have to figure out who they are. You just know that they're trusted. So does that mean logging in a second time?
No, it's doing as part of the enrollment process, where it's saying, okay, we know that there was this thing called an M1, a meaningless but unique number, saying, okay, number 123, we know that you're a real person. We know that you're a real client of a bank. You have a relationship with a financial institution, but we have no idea who you are. And then in the case of Service Canada, they would actually say, okay, we're going to ask you a few out-of-band questions. We'll mail you an access code to a letter of address for enrollment. And then once they say, oh, okay, this 123 actually maps to our program identifier, like the social insurance number, it actually maps to 456. So then when 123 comes in, courtesy their bank, we know that it maps to 456, and we just say, hi, Alistair, it's you. We very clearly separated the process for privacy. And of course, like the downside is that you'd have to go through that exact same process, not only with Service Canada, but with CRA and Passport, etc.
Oh, so you log in with your bank, and then each time you go to a different service, you got to tell that department, hey, that thing that comes in from the bank, number 123, that's me, which is why each time you add like the CRA or EI or something, you have to go through that process again.
Yeah, because what we were cognizant of is that we had to honor the program authorities, the collection authorities. And while we could provide like that single sign-on, they would have to enroll separately in the different programs.
So what's GCKey? I've heard about GCKey a lot.
Yeah, GCKey is a similar service. One thing that we discovered very quickly, that there was a major clientele that had no relationship with the financial institutions. Like if you're applying for immigration to Canada, you don't actually have a relationship with the financial institution, so you can't log in with your bank. So then we created GCKey, which was a parallel service that enabled you to actually get a username and password and a credential to get into the systems. And there are people that just simply did not want to use their banks.
So GCKey is like a parallel thing if you don't want to use your bank. And then once you've got a GCKey, do you have to go associate that for each department?
Yeah, it's the same thing. Like you basically have two doors. You could go in, continue with your bank or continue with GCKey. And then once you're in, then you're in with that special identifier that we talked about. And then you'd have to enroll in the separate programs.
So we have GCKey. I've read that it serves around 20 million Canadians across 30 departments, but that the CRA has issues with it, or is the CRA using it now?
The interesting thing about CRA, and people might not be aware, Service Canada is a department of the Government of Canada. They fall under direct authority of Treasury Board.
Treasury Board are the people that make the rules for government departments.
Yeah. Treasury Board and Treasury Board Secretariat. Other organizations such as CRA, they're agencies, and they have more discretion in what they can do. Like they're a separate employer. Same with the RCMP, same with CBSA. They're not departments, they're agencies.
So when the federal government sets a policy, they're agencies, they can't tell them what to do. They just have to go, here's a suggestion, please do this.
Yeah, and usually, like CRA, I always called them a good corporate citizen, but they always had a plan B. They would always keep you on your toes because they would always say, well, we've got a system here that's working and we're not obliged by Treasury Board policy, but we want to follow it. So we always had like a super constructive relationship with with CRAs. Other ones have more latitude in what they can do.
It does sound a little bit like the notwithstanding clause, but applied to government, where you can do what you want, but you have your ability to walk away. So the UK spent £233 million on a program called Gov UK Verify, and they built it with a private sector company. They only achieved a 47% success rate, and then they shut it down. One of the reasons for this was that their version of the CRA refused to buy into the system, refused to play along. They're trying again with this thing called One Login, which they built themselves instead of with the private sector. And they already have 11 million users on it. Meanwhile, Canada announced this thing called Sign in Canada that was supposed to be implemented in fall of 2019. Now it's 2025, and we're still waiting. So what is it that is it this kind of issue, or is it something else that makes a government-wide login system so monumentally difficult?
Yeah, what's different about the UK? I've been there. The Government Digital Services. I was back there in 2013, kind of in the heady days when they were developing their login service. They have more direct authority over their departments. So, for example, like driver's licensing and passport is part of the same program. So it's easy to manage, easy to mandate. I just remember one of the watchwords there was spend control. They could manage these things by saying, hey, we're not going to give you funds if you don't do what we're going to do. In Canada, for better, for worse, we're much more decentralized and have delegated a lot of the services to departments and agencies that have a lot more independence. And it's really hard to actually get everyone on the same page, much less saying that they will rely on a single government-wide system. It's just a big change management exercise.
Well, it sounds like it's more than change management. It sounds like you've actually got to change some laws for which you need popular support. So let's address the elephant in the room here. The Conservative Party have a petition to ban mandatory digital IDs. They are afraid of government surveillance and government tracking. And we just discovered that the CRA failed to report 35,000 privacy breaches between 2020 and 2023. Aren't these concerns kind of justified? Like, isn't this an argument that we should not be trying to come up with a single login for everybody, one ring to rule them all kind of framing?
That's the big question. The policy work that we did, we never talked about like a single login. That might be an implementation option, but that certainly wasn't a policy option. Back in 2019, when we did a major revision to the Treasury Board policy, we put in this concept of accepting trusted digital identities. And it wasn't about single sign-in. And what we really had on our radar screen was that, okay, so we did authentication with the banks, successful to some degree. But now we were looking to the provinces and territories. And the idea there was that, hey, you live in a province, you live in a territory. They know who you are based on the driver's licensing, education, health. And so we started to look at the idea of letting them do the authentication and the verification and making sure that they manage the life cycle of that individual. And just accepting that trusted digital identity into federal programs. So the idea was that, sure, you could have the sign-in partners with your financial institutions, but what we were successful in doing with the province of Alberta and the province of BC is saying, hey, if you've already authenticated, you've already done your identity proofing, they know who you are. If you log in with your BC Services card or My Alberta account, you can be redirected over to the federal services and get right in once you're enrolled.
So you still have to map your identity from Alberta Services too. So basically, if I understand this correctly, this is kind of like signing with Google, signing with Facebook, using some kind of open authentication, not necessarily the protocol. And so you sign in with someone the government has a reason to trust, but you have to do this for each different department you want to interact with.
Yeah. And so by the time we onboarded Alberta and more specifically BC, we were taking advantage of those more modern protocols that did not exist at the outset of the cyber authentication renewal. So what was a little bit different and made it a lot easier for the provinces is not only would your identifier be passed, but you'd actually have the name, the date of birth, and a few other pieces of information so that they could map it immediately.
Got it.
That was the idea. So what was completely out of bounds with the banks and the financial institutions is like, hey, just give us that random number. Thank you very much. And then we'll do the hard work. But with BC and Alberta, we said, okay, give us not only the unique identifier, but also give us the name and the date of birth. And that typically was sufficient enough to uniquely identify the individual within the population. So if you're coming from Montreal or Quebec, Alistair, and we have, it comes across the wire, your name, date of birth, they can be 99.99% sure that it's actually you.
What happens when they're not sure?
There may be some additional confirmation. But what we did was we made a very clear division between that identity authentication, credential authentication, and enrollment into the program. So it's still the responsibility of the department, even though they're getting accurate information coming across the line, and maybe they can enroll them immediately. It was still the responsibility of the department to make sure that the right Alistair from Quebec is mapped to the right Alistair in their program.
So every different department of the government has to have people whose job it is to figure out who you are when you log in and make sure you're actually that person.
For the enrollment process, I don't know if they need to use people. It may be automated, but the idea was that we're just trying to give an incremental step. And keep in mind here, you're dealing with legacy systems, you're dealing with different authorities. This is a massive institutional nudging exercise. It's not even change management, it's nudging. It was a big accomplishment just getting federal departments and agencies to say, yeah, we don't actually have to do the identity proofing anymore, or we don't have to do the authentication anymore. We can actually rely on Alberta and BC that they've done those processes, and what comes across the wire, there's enough information to actually map it to that same person in another program.
Is it easier for the province of Alberta to send the federal government stuff than for two federal departments to send each other stuff?
Yeah, good question. What are you referring to, like personal information or identity
Like in this
information?
case, the province of Alberta is sending the federal government some information to identify someone, but it sounds like two different government departments at the federal level can't send information to one another because of the Privacy Act.
Yeah, that sounds fair.
That's kind of weird that the federal government can't tell itself about someone, but the provinces can. Seems a little strange, especially given that many of the critics about privacy are coming from Alberta.
So there was a very substantial agreement negotiated between, at the time, Her Majesty and Right of Canada with Her Majesty and Right of Alberta. And it was a huge agreement. And the only information at the end of the day that was being shared from the province to the federal government was about 4 or 5 attributes: a unique identifier, the name, the date of birth. There's a couple of other items, but that's about it.
How long did it take to negotiate that?
Oh, it was a big project. There was like 6 sort of work streams. One was a technical integration. The other one was a privacy impact assessment. The other one was communications. There was negotiating the agreement. The other thing that I was leading was doing what was called the PCTF, or Pan-Canadian Trust Framework Assessment, where we, from the federal government point of view, had a very close look at the provincial program to make sure it was doing what it was supposed to be doing so that we could have confidence in actually accepting what we call the trusted digital identity. Well, the first time around, it took us a better part of 6 months because it was a learning process. We started that in 2018 with the province of Alberta, and we reviewed their program. We had literally hundreds of criteria that we had to assess and evaluate and work with the team. And what we're doing is we're saying to the federal government that you don't have to do everything by yourself. You can rely on the province. But in order for us to convince them, we had to go through this very detailed assessment process. And then internally, we had to do like a formal briefing and create what was called a letter of acceptance. We had to get it all vetted by the lawyers and make sure everything was fine. BC was a lot quicker because we were developing a whole methodology. The nice thing is we publish it all. It's all up on GitHub. The methodology that we used, and so we're just going very, very carefully.
Do you think the other provinces will get on board soon?
I know that other provinces are going through the assessment process as well. There's discussions to actually make it even easier. So, for example, one of the things that we discovered, it was kind of obvious, but a lot of these digital identity programs ride on top of existing capabilities like health insurance or healthcare or driver's licensing or education or vital statistics. And there are some organizations that standardized driver licensing. Like in the US, it's AMVA. In Canada, it's the Council of Motor Transport Administrators. So there's some concepts saying, hey, like if you're using like driver's licensing or health, and they already have some agreements in place to do identity in their particular domains, let's just recognize that and just make the whole process easier.
So I'm a Quebecer, which means I don't really hold my breath for federal provincial integration. But I know that we've had SACLIC and a bunch of other things that have kind of failed miserably. When I log into some of these government services, it asks me to give it like, what was your uncle's name? What's your favorite food? Which is like very bad security practice. I mean, it's literally the stuff security people say don't do. You know, it asks you for a password that has a certain number of uppercase and lowercase and special character letters. Companies like Microsoft and Google are now saying, look, passwords are obsolete. We should push passkeys. We should have a single strong password with two-factor authentication. Are we building a new system based on old thinking? Like, has the world already moved on from where we are?
No, there's some really good work that's happening that the federal government is very quiet about. If you dig hard enough, you can find the RFIs, or requests for information. And I know that there's some proposals going forward. I don't know all the details, but they're just being really, really quiet.
Why?
Just, it doesn't have much political cover. If you say the word digital ID, you end up talked about in a YouTube video. The concept is digital credentials or verifiable credentials, like having a digital credential on your phone, for example, or digital ID on your phone. Like Apple is actually providing that capability now, or announced it in the US. It might happen in Canada. There was a lot of work, and I actually led some work back in 2018 on verifiable credentials, where we worked with a variety of private sector vendors to develop the concept of what it would mean to accept a digital credential that might have your identity already proven within it. So once you have that provisioned on your phone or provision on a device from your province or your territory, boom, you could have the fast path into a federal program. So once again, that's going very quietly. And I think what's going to happen is that the whole verifiable credentials or digital credentials will make these authentication systems obsolete.
And you've been keeping it really simple, and I appreciate that. You have a, galaxy brain when it comes to this stuff. So I'm finally going to unleash you and let you talk about some things you love. Can you tell me the difference between a claim and identity? Because it seems that we don't have the proper vocabulary to discriminate between the different things these credentials are doing. So for the back of the room that wasn't paying attention, what's a credential? What's a claim? What is identity?
A good analogy to understand the differences, the nuances, is think of your email address. Okay, you got your email address. There's a term called validation. Validation is the format correct? Is it actually a valid email address that I can send to? That's called validation. Let's validate the email address. The second part is verification. Okay, we got a valid email address, but is this one that actually Alistair uses? So the way we're going to verify it is we're going to say, hey, Alistair, we're going to send you a code, a random code, ask you some information. And if you respond, we're going to say, yep, we know that this email address belongs to Alistair. And then we might use that for recovery. When we're talking about authentication, I like to use a term to define that I'm authenticating you for a here and now. I need to establish a session with you. I want to talk to you now, and I want to have a secure session with you. So I know this is Alistair's email address. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to send him a special code. And if he replies with that special code back, then I'll create that secure session.
You have a reasonable belief that the person who is giving you that code is the person who received the email, who you think is Alistair, for a certain amount of time. So
here's the rub. You're never 100% certain.
Sure.
And this is where some of the newer technologies are trying to close that gap into 100% certainty. You're hearing about like facial recognition and liveness to make sure it's actually Alistair. There's really good stuff there. We talked about passkeys earlier on. If I know that I was the only one as a provider that put that private key on your device, I'm pretty darn sure that when the public key of that private key comes back, I know it comes from that device.
And that's like saying there's a key on your phone if it opens a lock, then the two match.
The other nice thing is that the app that actually opens that lock can be tied to the device security. So it's saying, hey, I'm not going to open it until you actually put your fingerprint on it or do the facial recognition.
The citizen in 2003, when you were designing these things, is very different from the citizen in 2025 who pays for everything by staring at their phone and holding it to a device, right? We have a much better understanding of this. And the devices tend to have, secure vaults to do this stuff. Like the actual phone has ways to prevent this from happening. So it seems like what's possible has moved dramatically. And now we're trying to retrofit Canada's legal structures and unique federations and so on to take advantage of what's now possible.
Yeah, totally agree. And when we started this journey 10, 15, 20 years ago, none of these capabilities existed, period. And so now maybe we actually have to go back to the drawing board on the policy.
And that does seem to be a real challenge here, is getting the political will to go back and say, hey, these policies are, 50 years old now. We should probably look at them. So I want to wrap up with a couple of quick questions. Yeah. Estonia estimates that they save 2% of their GDP annually by having digital services. Their citizens save what they claim is 5 days a year just from digital signatures. But they spent 22 years and 1% of their GDP annually to get there. Meanwhile, the Canadian Auditor General has said there is no funding for a national digital identity approach, but I did the math, and 2% of Canadian GDP would be $45 billion a year. Do you think we're setting ourselves up for failure by trying to do this on the cheap or without going back and actually pushing upstream and saying the laws have to change to make this possible?
Yeah, we're not investing. And we're just following. We're just watching what Estonia does. We're watching what other countries do. And there's really no will to actually make anything happen. That's where we're at. Yeah, I wish I could say more. Right now, there's such a fear that this will become like a conspiracy theory kind of thing, or criticism by all the influencers, that nobody actually wants to talk about it. And the other thing too is what doesn't really help is you see these policy pivots, like the UK went from enablement to enforcement, like in the time it took to do a speech.
What's the difference in enablement and enforcement?
Well, enabling you to get better access to services, to keeping immigrants out.
In the time it took to do a speech, yeah. I mean, we've also seen the political will change, obviously, to the south of here. Do you believe there are ways to design this stuff securely while still respecting autonomy of the individual and agency of the individual? I know you've got to be in your bonnet for all things blockchain, but distributed ledgers, zero knowledge, all these other technical topics that the listeners don't need to understand, have a pathway forward for this stuff, right?
Yeah. So like the first iteration of the internet, which we're still working on, is inherently insecure. Security was not an issue. It was communication. And the internet was wildly successful. You can communicate point to point anywhere in the world, period. Then they realized, we need to have some security. So they started to put security on top of that. Like now you have secure browsers, secure websites added on top. And then adding security features on top of inherently a house of sand of security. I believe what we have to do is we actually have to go back to first principles and say we have to design a protocol that's secure from the get-go. The other problem, when you're developing on top of a insecure architecture, you get these natural forces of centralization. I have to rely on Google for my authentication. I have to rely on their certificates to make sure my stuff is secure. And Google is really smart with Gmail, et cetera. They evolved that to an authentication system and to a centralized digital platform. And that's because underneath the protocols are inherently insecure. And so they built the security fortress on top of it, which actually causes natural centralization.
Google works great as long as you trust Google, right?
Yeah. And that was a okay assumption up until about a year ago. And so now, where there was assumption with cloud providers, with data platform providers, that, there might be issues around surveillance, if you will, in that. But now there's a real thinking of digital sovereignty. What's that mean? So now we're moving into a completely adversarial environment. And there's been lots of work done in this space, like zero trust networking. I think we actually have to go back and look at the services that we've built that have been built on an inherently insecure, fragmented platform and actually start thinking about, if we're to do this from ground zero, what we need to do. Estonia had that luxury. The Soviet Union bugged out. There was nothing.
And not just that, they didn't trust their government or governments in general. And so they basically had to build a system where if you don't trust anyone, the system still works.
Exactly. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to do some sort of Manhattan project to rethink this from the ground up.
Well, the irony here is that the people who don't trust government are the ones that should be supportive of this the most, because these protocols will allow us to trust government. I guess the challenge is that people need to just understand it. Okay, one final question. So I have a neighbor, and she just had her second child. And she has a bunch of stuff to do now that she's got this newborn. She has to apply for child benefits, update her tax information, register for parental leave, and a bunch of other things. In Estonia, that's one login, and the government already knows she had a baby because it came from hospital records. In Canada, that's multiple logins, multiple forms, and she has to prove she had a baby to each department separately. And then eventually that baby has to get some identification and authenticate itself. Estonia has this tell us once idea. That's the key to their efficiency, is that you tell the government what your address is, and the rest of the government's not allowed to ask you a second time. For that to work, there has to be like one authoritative home address or one authoritative birth date. And if there's a mistake, you fix that once and it gets fixed everywhere. Can Canada ever have that under the current legal framework, or are we doomed to have 30 or 40 different versions of the truth out there and have to argue with humans to get them to reconcile?
So there's a couple things here. When Estonia developed their system, they did it before the web took off. They actually were using that messaging bus architecture. So they had an advantage of using a technology that's actually way more flexible than what the web provided. So that's advantage one. The second part is that there has to be some sort of political will that brings together the provinces and the territories and the federal government to actually work in concert and make this look seamless. I just remember once being at a workshop on airport security, and it was amazing. I think there was about 7 or 8 or 9 different authorities that have to work in concert so that you actually get to the airport. You have CATSA, you have CBSA, you have the securities clearing, you have the airlines doing their thing, and they had workshops to figure out how to make everything work as seamlessly as possible. I literally think we have to do the same thing here. I know there's been work on like citizen-centric service delivery. SIN at birth is another great example where there's coordination.
Wouldn't that be better if we called it the original SIN? Come on.
I know. I just have to laugh at that name, but hey, that's that. But I think there has to be real political will, not only with the federal government, but with the provinces and the territories to say, hey, we need to make this better for Canadians. And who's going to lead that as a whole? I don't know. That's the problem. I don't know. Is it a province by example? Is it the federal government by de jure, by making rules? That's a discussion we have to have. There's a more fundamental governance discussion that has to be had for these new digital capabilities. I talked about the cryptographic capabilities. We have to rethink how we build systems. We have to rethink governance as well in a nation such as Canada. Like, we could take the European approach where states delegate everything to the European Commission to just write regulations, but I don't think that's going to work in Canada. We have to have that serious discussion of how we're going to structure ourselves to move forward as a singular nation. And unfortunately, like the environment has changed over the last 6 months. That discussion is happening. Like, there are now outside pressures that we didn't have to worry about. Now we do. So now there's pressure to do that, and I'm starting to see that. So yeah, we'll see where this goes.
All right. That was great. Thank you so much for sharing all that stuff with us. It's really good. I know we covered a lot and we didn't cover a whole lot more. So we'll have to have another conversation on the deeper technical stuff that you and I love. But I really appreciate you sharing all that, Tim.
My pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on the Functional Government Podcast.